The heavy steel door of the mill usually marked the end of Denise's shift. But tonight, the cold air outside felt more dangerous than the furnace. When she stepped into her kitchen, the silence was broken by the rhythmic, violent thud of a heavy boot splintering her front door. Through the floral curtains, the headlights of a black pickup truck cut through the dark, illuminating two men who weren't there for a chat. They weren't shouting about the weather. They were shouting about a debt that didn't belong to her, but was about to cost her everything. As she shoved her terrified children under the bed, her hands shook not from the cold, but from the weight of a gray folder she'd just unearthed from a hidden drawer. Inside weren't family photos or birth certificates, but a string of zeros where her life savings used to be, and a foreclosure notice with a signature that looked hauntingly like her own. The house groaned under another blow, and as the metal lock began to warp, Denise realized the man she shared her bed with had turned their home into a target. She had 12 hours of soot under her fingernails and a lifetime of discipline in her veins. But as the engine outside roared like a predator, she knew the real fight hadn't even reached the factory floor yet. Heavy work boots thudded against the grease-slicked concrete, a dull, rhythmic sound that echoed through the cavernous belly of the steel mill. Denise Mallory moved with the mechanical precision of a woman who had long ago traded her soul for a steady paycheck. The air here was a thick, poisonous soup of scale and burnt metal, pressing against her lungs until every breath felt like swallowing grit. Behind her, the monstrous hum of the rolling mills vibrated through the soles of her feet, a bone-deep tremor that never truly left her, even in sleep. Her back was a map of knots and fire. 12 hours at the mouth of the furnace had turned her muscles into rigid cords of tension. She wiped a hand across her forehead, leaving a smear of dark soot that settled into the deep lines etched around her eyes. The dust was everywhere. In her pores, under her jagged fingernails, in the very grain of her voice. Her fingers, stiff and trembling, white-knuckled the strap of a heavy canvas bag as she pushed through the final set of heavy steel doors. Outside, the morning air hit her like a physical blow. The Pittsburgh winter was a cruel, damp thing, smelling of river rot and industrial exhaust. She squinted against the pale, sickly light of a sun that struggled to pierce the overcast sky. On the gravel parking lot, the wind whipped around her, stinging eyes already reddened by heat and lack of rest. She reached her old sedan, a rusted relic held together by prayer and duct tape, and fumbled with the keys. The metal was ice cold, biting into her palm, a sharp reminder that the world outside the mill was just as unforgiving as the fires within. The drive to Glenwood was a blur of gray on gray. The car's heater groaned, blowing lukewarm air that smelled of old upholstery and burnt oil. But Denise hardly noticed. Her mind was a repetitive loop of production quotas and the dull ache in her joints. As she pulled onto the cracked asphalt of her driveway, the tires crunched softly over the frost-covered gravel. She killed the engine, letting the silence of the neighborhood wash over her for a fleeting second. Inside the house, the air changed. It smelled of cheap laundry detergent and the faint, lingering sweetness of the cocoa the kids must have had before bed. Denise moved like a ghost, easing the front door shut with a practiced touch to keep the hinges from shrieking. She stepped out of her boots, the relief of shedding that weight almost enough to make her knees buckle. On her way to the kitchen, she paused by the children's bedroom. The door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of hallway light falling across the tangled blankets. She watched the rhythmic rise and fall of the covers, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of Lisa and Toby. For a moment, the iron band around her chest loosened. This was the reason for the soot, the heat, and the bone-deep exhaustion. She pulled the door shut with the gentleness of a prayer. shielding their fragile peace from the world she had just walked out of. The kitchen was a graveyard of shadows and unwashed mugs. The neon clock on the wall ticked with a frantic, mechanical energy that set her teeth on edge. Denise pulled open the junk drawer, the one overflowing with expired coupons, broken crayons, and half-finished grocery lists. She was looking for the electric bill, a mundane task that usually anchored her morning routine. Her fingers brushed past a stack of takeout menus and landed on something different, something thick and textured. She pulled out a gray folder, hidden beneath a false bottom of yellowing newspapers. Her pulse quickened. There was no label on the spine, no identifying mark to suggest why it had been buried so deep. She laid it on the Formica tabletop, the surface still sticky from a spilled juice box. Under the harsh, flickering glow of the overhead fluorescent light, her hands began to shake. She untied the thin strings with a sense of mounting dread, a cold shiver racing down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. The first page was a bank statement. Denise's eyes locked onto the columns of figures, her mind struggling to process the string of zeros where thousands of dollars should have been. Her breathing became a jagged, whistling sound in the quiet kitchen. She flipped through the pages with frantic, clumsy movements, searching for Lisa's college fund, the account she had meticulously fed with every scrap of overtime for 5 years. It was gone. Closed. The balance sat at a mocking zero. A sharp spasm of nausea hit her, and she gripped the edges of the table so hard her fingernails dug into the wood. Every hour spent sweating in the mill, every missed birthday, every double shift. It had all evaporated into thin air. She felt the blood thundering in her temples, a dull, rhythmic drumming that drowned out the ticking clock. Deeper in the folder, she found a document with a heavy, official seal. The words, "Notice of Foreclosure," leaped off the page, blurred by the sudden sting in her eyes. At the bottom of the page, a signature sprawled across the line. It looked like hers, the same looping D, the same sharp M. But the slant was wrong. It was Mark's handwriting, a crude imitation of her own. He had mortgaged the house. He had signed away the only roof their children had. The betrayal was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. Anger, hot and corrosive, flooded her system, burning through the fog of her fatigue. She was still staring at the forged signature when a low, guttural roar vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a heavy engine, something with too much horsepower for a quiet suburban street. Denise lunged for the window, peeling back the edge of the floral curtain. A massive black pickup truck, its windows tinted to the color of ink, was rolling slowly over her front lawn. The heavy tires tore into the soft, rain-soaked turf, leaving deep, ugly gashes of mud in their wake. A cloud of acrid exhaust drifted toward the porch. Denise's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. On the side of the truck, a small, discreet emblem caught the light. A private debt collection agency. The vehicle lurched to a halt right in front of the porch, the engine idling with a menacing growl that made the glasses in the cupboard rattle. The doors swung open, and 2 men stepped out. They were broad-shouldered, encased in heavy leather jackets that made them look like blocks of granite. Denise watched through the glass as their heavy boots trampled the marigolds she'd planted with Lisa. The first blow against the front door was so violent, it felt like a gunshot. The entire house seemed to shudder. "Mallory, open up!" A voice, gravelly and thick with malice, cut through the wood. "We know you're in there, Mark. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The pounding became a relentless rhythm, a drumbeat of impending ruin. Denise stood frozen in the center of the hallway, her mind racing. She could hear the wood of the door frame beginning to groan under the assault. One of the men started kicking the lower panel, the heavy thuds echoing through the house. She didn't think. She moved. She sprinted to the children's room, her movements fueled by a sudden, sharp clarity. Lisa and Toby were sitting up, their eyes wide and glassy with terror, clutching their stuffed animals to their chests. "Get down," Denise hissed, her voice a jagged whisper. "Under the bed. Right now. Do not make a sound, do you hear me? No matter what happens." She shoved them toward the narrow space under the frame, her hands trembling as she tucked their small legs in. She yanked the heavy blackout curtains shut, plunging the room into a suffocating gloom, then backed out and turned the key in the lock. Her children were safe for now, but the front door was screaming under the pressure. Denise pressed her back against the solid oak of the front door, feeling the vibrations of the collector's fists through her spine. She took a deep, shuddering breath and screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with the effort. "He's not here. Mark is gone. Get off my property, or I'm calling the police." A harsh, mocking laugh erupted from the other side. "Yeah? Call 'em. Maybe they'll help you pack, 'cause this house belongs to the bank now, lady." A heavy boot slammed into the area near the lock, and Denise saw the metal strike plate begin to deform, the wood splintering in slow motion. She backed away into the hallway, her hands clamped over her mouth to stifle a sob. They were shouting descriptions of the furniture now, talking about the television and the fridge like they were already on the back of a truck. The threats against Mark were worse. Graphic, casual promises of what they would do to his legs when they caught him. Each new blow felt like it was landing directly on her skull. The terror was a cold, oily slick in her gut. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the pounding stopped. She heard the heavy tread of boots retreating down the porch steps, followed by the roar of the pickup's engine. "We'll be back tonight, Mallory," the voice bellowed over the engine. "Tell your husband the clock is ticking." The truck peeled out, spraying gravel against the siding of the house. Denise collapsed against the wall, her legs finally giving out. She sat on the floor for a long time, the silence of the house feeling heavier than the noise had been. Her eyes drifted to Mark's old roll-top desk in the corner of the living room, a piece of furniture he treated like a shrine. She scrambled toward it, yanking the drawers open with such force that one of them fell off its tracks, spilling a cascade of unpaid bills and crumpled betting slips onto the carpet. She dug through the mess, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Near the bottom, tucked into a slit in the wood, she found a small rectangle of cardstock. The copper penny. The name was embossed in a cheap, oily gold leaf. On the back, in Mark's unmistakable, frantic scrawl, was a series of numbers and a date. The card smelled of stale hops and the kind of cheap tobacco that clung to Mark's clothes every time he came home late. She gripped the card until the edges bit into her palm. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that felt like the steel she forged at the mill. The police wouldn't help. The bank wouldn't listen. If she wanted to save her children, she had to go to the source of the rot. Denise stood up, her back straight, and looked at the locked door of the children's room. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was the only thing standing between her family and the abyss. The air in the kitchen was stagnant, thick with the smell of old coffee and the metallic tang of fear. Denise stood in the shadows near the refrigerator, her eyes fixed on the back door. She didn't have to wait long. The sound of tires on gravel was followed by the hesitant, uneven footsteps of a man who knew he was walking into a trap. When the lock clicked and the door swung open, Denise didn't say a word. She lunged forward, grabbing the gray folder from the table and slamming it down onto the center of the wood. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Mark flinched, his keys clattering to the floor. He looked at the folder, then at Denise, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Denise, I can explain, he started, his voice a thin, reedy whine. Explain this? She pointed a trembling finger at the zeros in the college fund. Explain the mortgage? Explain the men who were just here trying to kick in our door while our children were hiding under their beds? Her voice was low, vibrating with a rage so intense it felt like it might shatter the windows. Mark sank to his knees, his hands reaching out to grab the hem of her work jacket. It was supposed to be a sure thing. He sobbed, the tears carving clean tracks through the grime on his face. A tech startup, Denise. We were going to triple the money in a month. I just needed a little more time. Denise looked down at him, her stomach churning. He smelled of whiskey, the cheap stuff from the bottom shelf, and the desperate, cloying scent of a man who had run out of lies. He tried to wrap his arms around her ankles, blubbering about how he did it for them, for the family. She stepped back, wrenching her leg away with such force he nearly fell flat on his face. For us? You sold our home for a bet, Mark? You stole Lisa's future for a sure thing? She grabbed him by the collar of his coat, her strength surprising even herself, and dragged him toward the bedroom. He stumbled along, too broken to resist. She shoved him inside and slammed the door, turning the key in the lock with a final, metallic snap. He started scratching at the wood, his pleas muffled and pathetic, but she ignored him. She leaned her forehead against the cool door frame, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't wait for the men in the black truck to come back. The drive to the city was dark, the highway flanked by the skeletal remains of old warehouses. She pulled her sedan into the shadow of a row of rusted shipping containers a block away from the address on the card. The neon sign for the copper penny flickered rhythmically, casting a jaundiced yellow light over the oil-slicked puddles in the alley. Inside, the bar was a cavern of blue smoke and hushed voices. It smelled of spilled beer and decades of desperation. Denise's boots felt like they were sticking to the floor as she moved toward the back, her eyes scanning the room. A few men in grease-stained caps watched her pass, their expressions unreadable, but she didn't slow down. She found him in a booth near the back, a man they called Mr. Carlo. He was older, with skin like cured leather and gold rings that looked too heavy for his fingers. He didn't look up as she approached. He just slid a stack of papers across the scarred wood of the table. Denise looked down. They were markers, hand-drawn IOUs with her name forged at the bottom in that same frantic, shaky hand. Mark's been a busy man, Carlo said, his voice a dry rasp. He tapped a thick finger on a calendar pinned to the wall. But the bank doesn't wait, and neither do I. The vig on this kind of debt. It's a living thing, Mrs. Mallory. It grows while you sleep. He laid out the math with a casual, brutal indifference. The numbers were staggering, a mountain of debt that her salary at the mill couldn't even begin to erode. Every word he spoke felt like a lead weight being dropped into her chest. I don't have it, she whispered, her voice sounding small in the smoky room. Then you better find it, Carlo replied, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Because the guys I sent this morning, they're the polite ones. Denise pushed through the heavy exit door, her head spinning. The cool night air felt like a reprieve, but it was short-lived. As she stepped onto the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, a harsh yellow light cut through the dark. A tow truck, a predatory-looking thing with a heavy hydraulic arm, was backed up to her sedan. A man in a reflective vest was already hooking a steel chain to her front axle. "Hey, that's my car!" Denise shouted, sprinting across the lot. The man didn't even look up. "Orders from the city, lady. Repossession. You're 6 months behind." The screech of metal on metal as he tightened the winch set her teeth on edge. It was the last straw. The house, the money, the kids. And now the only way she had to get to work. To earn the money she didn't have. She lunged for him, grabbing his arm as he reached for the controls. "You are not taking this car." The man tried to shove her back, his face twisting in a sneer. "Get lost, lady. It's not your car anymore." Denise didn't back down. She threw her weight into him, her heavy work boots sliding in the mud as they grappled. The rain began to fall then. A cold, miserable drizzle that turned the dirt into a slick slurry. They went down together, rolling in the muck. Denise felt the sting of gravel against her cheek and the cold slime of the puddles soaking into her clothes. But she didn't let go. She saw the glint of the keys hanging from his belt. With a guttural cry, she wrenched them free and scrambled away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The man started to get up, cursing and wiping mud from his eyes, but Denise was faster. She scrambled into the driver's seat and slammed the door, locking it just as his fist hit the glass. The engine groaned, coughing a cloud of black smoke, but it caught. She slammed the car into reverse, the frame shuddering as it tore free from the tow hook with a violent, metallic jolt. She didn't look back. She swung the wheel hard, spraying the man in the reflective vest with a fan of muddy water, and roared out of the lot. The clock on the dashboard told her she had 20 minutes to get to the mill for the start of the graveyard shift. She floored the accelerator, the engine screaming in protest, as she disappeared into the rain. The locker room was a grim, windowless box that smelled of industrial soap and the lingering ghosts of 1,000 shifts. Denise leaned against her locker, her breath hitching in her chest. Every muscle in her body felt like it had been shredded and stitched back together with wire. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling, and froze. A bright, neon-red flyer was taped directly over her nameplate. The adhesive was still wet, the paper curling at the edges from the humidity. Notice of investigation. Child Welfare Services. The words blurred before her eyes. The seal of the state looked like a brand. They were coming for the kids. The missed payments, the reports of men at the door. The system was finally turning its cold, bureaucratic eye toward her home. A chill that had nothing to do with the mill's draft raced from the base of her skull down to her heels. She sank onto the narrow wooden bench, the wood groaning under her weight. She pulled a stubby pencil from her pocket and began to scribble frantically on the back of the red notice. Numbers, shifts, overtime multipliers. She calculated and recalculated, her mind a frantic abacus. No matter how she moved the figures, the gap between her paycheck and the debt to the penny was a canyon. "Mallory, you're on the floor in 5. The floor boss bellowed as he swung through the door. Denise stood, her legs feeling like lead. She wiped the sweat from her neck, adjusted her heavy leather apron, and stepped out into the roar of the plant. The air in the furnace room was a living thing. A vibrant, pulsing heat that distorted the light. Huge ladles of molten steel, glowing a terrifying, brilliant orange, glided overhead on massive rails. Denise took her position at the control station, her eyes stinging from the fumes. She gripped the steel tongs, the heat radiating through her heavy gloves, and began the grueling process of clearing the slag. Every breath felt like inhaling liquid fire. She was mid-shift, her vision tunneling from the heat, when she saw a flash of movement on the catwalks above. It wasn't a worker. The figure was wearing a tattered suit jacket, dodging between the steam pipes like a cornered animal. It was Mark. He was running along the narrow technical bridge, his sweetie face pale even in the orange glow of the vats. The security guards were shouting below, their flashlights cutting through the haze, but Mark didn't stop. He scrambled down a ladder, nearly falling into a trough of cooling water, and sprinted toward her station. "Denise!" he screamed. his voice barely audible over the thunder of the machinery. He lunged at her, his fingers digging into her shoulders with a strength born of pure, unadulterated terror. "The card, Denise. Give me the card for the reserve account. They're at the gates. They said they'd kill me." He was frantic, his eyes darting around the shadows of the massive presses as if the collectors were already emerging from the steam. He started clawing at her waist, trying to find the hidden pocket where she kept her emergency cash. "Get off me, Mark!" she roared, shoving him back, but he wouldn't let go. He lunged for the main control panel, his hand hovering over the emergency stop, the big red. "If I don't get that money, I'm dead anyway," he wailed. If he hit that button, the cooling systems would fail. Tons of molten steel would solidify in the crucibles, destroying millions of dollars in equipment and stripping Denise of the only job she had left. She threw her entire weight into him, pinning his arm against the rippled steel of the floor. They struggled on the very edge of the platform. Below them, the massive gears of the industrial scrap press churned, a rhythmic, bone-crushing sound that swallowed the screams of the machinery. Mark was delusional, sobbing that the money was his ticket out, his last chance to stay out of the gutter. Denise looked into his eyes and saw only the hollow, selfish void that had eaten their life. With a sudden, violent jerk, Mark pulled back, trying to wrench her toward the edge. Her heavy boots slipped on a patch of hydraulic oil. For a heart-stopping second, she was teetering over the abyss, the heat from the press below rising up like a physical hand. She found her footing, her fingers finding purchase on a hot railing that scorched through her glove. With a cry of primal rage, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled bank statements she'd found that morning. "You want the money, Mark? Here's your money." She hurled the papers into his face. They struck him like a physical blow, fluttering around his head in a white cloud. He blinked, his grip loosening for just a second as he tried to catch the fluttering evidence of his own betrayal. A stray spark from the furnace caught the edge of a page. In an instant, the air was filled with swirling, blackened ash. The records of their debt, the forged signatures, the zeros, they vanished into the updraft, turned to soot in the blink of an eye. "You're nothing," Denise screamed, her voice tearing through the roar of the turbines. "You're not worth a single drop of my sweat." Mark backed away, his face contorted in a mask of pathetic horror. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a woman he no longer recognized. He saw the steel she had become. He turned and fled, disappearing into the swirling steam and shadows of the mill. Denise didn't follow. She turned back to her station, her hand trembling as she gripped the lever of the press. With a sharp, decisive motion, she brought the hammer down. The clang of the steel was a final, deafening punctuation mark. The house was silent when she returned, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a tomb. Denise walked into the living room and found Mark hunched over the coffee table, a kitchen knife in his hand. He was frantically prying at the plastic slot of Lisa's piggy bank. The sound of a single quarter hitting the floor was the loudest thing Denise had ever heard. She didn't scream. She moved with the silent, predatory grace of someone who had nothing left to lose. She caught him by the collar and slammed him against the wall, the plaster cracking behind his head. With her other hand, she pulled a small black recorder from her pocket and set it on the table. The voice of Mr. Carlo filled the room, cold, casual, and utterly lethal. "Tell Mark if I don't see the Vig by sunrise. I start with his fingers and end with his front door, with the kids inside." Mark turned the color of ash. He stared at the spinning tape, his breath coming in shallow, terrified hitches. Denise leaned in close, her scent of smoke and grease filling his lungs. "Sign the papers, Mark." She spread the legal documents out on the table. They were crisp, smelling of fresh ink, the voluntary termination of parental rights and a full quitclaim deed to the house. She'd had them drawn up by a legal aid clinic weeks ago, a just-in-case that had become her only now. Either you sign these and you're on a bus out of this state by noon, or I hit call on this phone. She held up her cell. The screen was already glowing with the number of a detective she'd met during a factory theft investigation. I have the files from your cloud, Mark, the betting logs, the names. You'll be in a cell before the sun is up, and Carlo will know exactly who put him there. Mark lunged for the folder, his face twisted in a snarl. But Denise was faster. She whipped out a heavy-duty box cutter, the blade clicking into place with a sound like a cocked pistol. She didn't flinch. She stood her ground, the cold light in her eyes stopping him dead in his tracks. Sign. It. With a shaking hand, Mark took the pen. The scratch of the nib on the paper was the only sound in the room. He signed every page, his tears blurring the ink, until the last document was done. He dropped the pen like it was red hot. Denise didn't offer him a word of comfort. She went to the closet, pulled out his old, battered gym bag, and began throwing his things inside. Clothes, shoes, a half-empty bottle of gin. She dragged him to the front door and shoved him out onto the porch. "Don't come back," she said, her voice as hard as a forge hammer. "If I see your face in this town again, I'll finish what the collectors started." She slammed the door and turned the deadbolt. Through the window, she watched him stumble toward the street, catching a ride with a passing truck. The red taillights faded into the gray mist of Glenwood, and for the first time in 10 years, Denise felt like she could breathe. She picked up the phone. Her voice was steady as she spoke to the child services operator. "My name is Denise Mallory. I'm calling to report a change in my household status. Mark Mallory is gone. I'd like to schedule an inspection as soon as possible." She hung up and walked into the backyard. In an old rusted oil drum, she started a fire. She watched as the wedding photos, the old cards, and everything that smelled of him turned to white ash. The smoke rose into the pale Pittsburgh sky, joining the smog from the mills. She went back inside and checked on the children. They were still asleep, their faces peaceful and oblivious. Denise sat on the edge of Lisa's bed and let out a long, shuddering breath. The debt wasn't gone. The house was still at risk. But the rot was out. As the first rays of a copper-red sun began to bleed over the horizon, Denise stood on her front porch with a mug of black coffee. The air was cold, but it felt clean. She looked out over the jagged skyline of the city she called home, at the smoke and the steel and the grit. She adjusted her work jacket, feeling the weight of the keys in her pocket. She had a shift at 4. She had a house to save. And for the first time, she knew she was strong enough to do it.